Hello there everybody and welcome to this channel. My name is Savvy, and for this video we're going to be working on a sea lion. So get your reference images ready and get your drawing pads out and let's get started. So as you can see here, I have this great model of the sea lion skeleton that I'm just going to be using as a reference. I won't be building up on this because as you can see, the model is kind of curved or rotated into a different kind of position, so it's already posed. So if you want to get something like this that you want to just build up on, depending on your end result, if you're going to actually just leave it as a posed model, or if you want to later on animate it, or you just want it to be in a generic pose, then you'd much rather get something that's already in that kind of pose, the skeletal structure. Or you can actually pose it yourself, which is just going to be a really tedious process where you're probably going to have to set up a rig for the skeletal structure itself, or you're just actually going to have to edit the mesh by yourself manually in edit mode. But for me here, I'm just using this as a guide or as a reference, and then I'm just gonna block out each piece together and then merge it together afterwards using Blender's remesher. Usually I use Blender's remesher, or I use another program, because Blender's remesher is not the best, it's not the greatest. I've mentioned this before, but you can get a third party, or you can actually download engines or add-ons to help with the remeshing, or you can just use another program if you want to, or something like that. So if you want to get actual models that are just like this, you can search online and you can find a bunch of them. Sketchfab, you can actually go in Sketchfab and just search up anatomy or the animal that you want to get the anatomy for. You can just find the skeletal structures, or you can even go onto TurboSquid or other websites, and you will just be lucky to find some of them, or you just do like a deep search and you'll find quite a few. Some of them might be free, some of them you would have to either purchase. But this is just for me to just have a guide, just for me to work quicker, so I don't have to actually think about like the proportions and the structure of the actual animal shapes and all that. Also, a quick note, when working on animals, characters, whatever you'll be doing or whatever you'll be working on in Blender or whatever 3D software that you're using, it is always best to get the real world scale and real world size and all the dimensions of that model or the subject that you're currently working on. This just helps in the long run. If you're going to be texturing, it'll help with the textural density. If you're working on if you're doing sort of simulations in Blender, it'll help with the simulations. It will help Blender to calculate it more accurately. Also, for you to get enough detail as well with the multi-resolution modifier, you don't have to bump the detail up or drop it down low, or you'll find a few issues when working in Blender if it's just not to real world scale. So just remember that whenever you're working on anything, just make sure that it's at real world scale, so you don't have to actually fix most of the issues in the long run or after you're done working. So if you're working on a human and he's 5 foot, then if the reference is of a 5 foot male in real world size or scale or whatever, then you can just drop down the scale of your character to the character of the reference, the real world reference that you're using. So if you notice here with the muscle groups, how I'm actually forming them, I'm using a curve and then I'm adding geometry onto it. I'm also making simple planes and then solidifying them to fill those other muscle groups, such as the gluteus medius, the maximus, the semitendinosus, and the biceps femoris all around the leg. And I also did the same thing for the entire body to just block out the entire shape a lot easier and a lot quicker. So each time you block out, there's going to be either some way that you prefer, an easier way. There'll be another process that you would actually like to use as well, like we've already covered, just actually modeling out everything by hand. We've also covered doing things the easier way using procedural mesh. Now we're also just doing the normal modeling practices, just getting your actual shapes blocked out with a normal plane, and then adding in some extra modifiers here and there to help with the process, and then also using curves. And it's a lot easier to do that so that you could also focus on your topology. The topology is very important when you add in a multi-resolution modifier here with the mesh, or whenever you're working with your animals or your figures or your creatures or whatever you're working on. You would notice that when you have better topology and you start sculpting on that topology, it feels a lot better and a lot smoother. It actually travels in the right direction and it flows correctly. If you just threw everything together and you blocked it out, unless you have a really good remesher or something that could actually merge things together like Blender's remesher isn't that great, like I've mentioned before, but they are add-ons that really help with that process. So if once you get something like that, if you get a hold of a good remesher like a quad mesh or something like that, then you would notice that once you start sculpting on that good topology or that good quadded topology, then it feels a lot smoother and a lot better for you to actually work on everything. So as you can see here already with the latissimus dorsi, and now moving on to the pectorals, it's just easier for me to skip certain forms, and I'm able to just come in with the clay strips and then actually sculpt everything perfectly without having to focus or go down on subdivision levels or even go up on subdivision levels. I'm just able to play around with the mesh itself, and it's easier to sculpt that way if you know that your topology follows along nicely. The good thing about sea lions is, well, it's just in the name. They're just lions in the sea, I suppose. Is that their anatomy is very similar to a lot of other mammals or a lot of other creatures that you could use as a reference, such as an actual normal lion. Think of it just as a lion with crippled legs, I suppose, with webbed crippled legs that just allows it to swim, I suppose. So you could actually use not just your sea lion anatomy or your seal anatomy. You could use that of a lion, probably another feline, or a rat, or something like that, something that is close to the animal that you're working on. Some other people might disagree that you have to actually just get the animal that you're working on, that reference, that specific reference, and then only use that and only work on that. But I'd like to mix it around a little. If you feel like there's something missing from this reference, you just can't get enough reference for this specific subject, then you can totally substitute it with something else. Like we've said before, like we've mentioned before, when I was working on the ape, when we're working on the ape in ZBrushCore, you did notice that we used human anatomy as well, because it's very similar. An ape's anatomy is very similar to a human, and a human's anatomy is very similar to an ape. So we're able to just fill in the gaps wherever we can, consider it a missing link in the reference, I suppose. So we're able to work with both of the references because they're just very similar. So it's just the same as other animals that you're working on, but it also depends on your knowledge of that animal as well. If you know that, okay, I can fill in this gap with this animal because it looks very similar to this, it looks very similar to that one, so I can fill it up with this. You can't just do it if you actually don't know what you're doing with the animal's anatomy. If you're unsure of how these actual parts merge together, if they actually look similar to another one, you might accidentally add parts to the animal that actually don't exist, or maybe they just don't look that way, they don't look the way that you put it and all that. So you just have to be very careful when it comes to like gathering reference images and information on the animal that you're working on. What I do like to do mostly when I'm working on all kinds of animals or creatures or even characters that are probably going to be thrown into a game in Unity or something like that, I like to get the underneath layers correct as well. I like to work on the skeleton just to make sure that everything is actually perfectly. So when I'm making a character, I would work on the écorché as well, and then I'll start filling in skin and muscle and all that, and try to make it all fit together and it actually works properly together. So right here, obviously, it's easier because we're just working on the écorché. You don't have to go an extra step further and start adding in fat or skin or veins. You can add all those kinds of stuff that you want. This is just the base layer. This is the base information that would probably help you if you're building a whole creature. But when working on animals, you have noticed in previous videos, I do like to actually make, or I would like to sculpt the animal, what it would look like without fur. And then I'll break it down and start adding in the écorché detail, the muscle structures. So you can also reverse engineer that and start building up on the skeletal structure first, and then you start sculpting the muscles, and then you start sculpting the fats and the skin. One important thing when working with the multi-resolution modifier, you have to remember that the modifier does freak out if your mesh isn't set up directly. Say, for example, you started working on the multi-resolution modifier and then you went back into the mesh in edit mode and you started deleting vertices, or you started adding certain vertices, or started adding loops and all that. That can break the multi-resolution modifier. So I did notice when I was working on the C-lines, abdominal obliques, the left side was still sculpted correctly, but the right side had strange artifacts. I do believe that that was probably because the mesh was moved slightly to the left on the x-axis. So probably the multi-resolution modifier was trying to add detail on the right side, but it just didn't have that enough information, perhaps. I'm not entirely sure. But just be careful when you're working with the multi-resolution modifier. It will break if you're editing the mesh and you're not doing it correctly. Say, for example, right at the end of this, you will see that the C-lines pose is different. I didn't edit the mesh. I did try originally. I did try to edit the mesh and move it around and rotate certain body forms and pose it myself in edit mode. But then once I enable the multi-resolution modifier again, it just completely broke. And that's because, you know, your mesh data, it's relying on mesh data and all that, and each vertex is given a certain ID, I suppose, and the multi-resolution modifier is trying to pick that up, I suppose. I don't know too much about it, but that's kind of what I guessed, and that's kind of what I got when I did my own little quick research on Google. But just be careful when you're doing that. So if you want to pose the sea lion or whatever creature you're working on, you would want to just either add a rig and then, or an armature or a rig, and actually pose it using the armature, and then apply the armature and then re-enable the multi-resolution modifier. Don't delete it, don't remove it, just hide it or disable it for a bit, edit the mesh using a rig or an armature, and then apply the armature and then re-enable your multi-resolution modifier. It just helps that way so your mesh won't really break. I believe I did the same thing with the crocodile. I modeled the crocodile, or I sculpted the crocodile in a different pose, and then right at the end it was already posed differently again. So I used a rig, and in the end of it all, this is what you get. So as you can see here, the sea lion is obviously in a different position. Its neck is a lot longer. It's also posed all the way up. It's looking up, and its body is slightly tilted. So all I did was just instead of editing the entire pose in edit mode, because like I said before, it will break the multi-resolution modifier, added an armature, and then I edited the entire pose via the armature. So you don't have to get a robust rig with crazy constraints and all these kind of movements and all that. All you want to do is just edit the shape. So you just make an armature or a rig for whatever you want the shape to do. So you edit the entire armature. You actually just add bones to whatever body part you want to move, and then you just move it and then you apply it. You can do this as many times as you want. You don't have to just have one rig. You can, if say for example you actually apply the previous rig that you worked on and then you want to do it again, so you can just add another rig. You don't have to undo or open up an old blend file. So that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed this entire video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Consider subscribing and enjoy.